It started with a letter. 5 words that didn't belong together. Your property is now under our jurisdiction. No seal, no signature, just a name. An HOA president claiming authority she didn't have. For one homeowner, it was supposed to be a quiet life outside the rules and fees of manicured suburbia. But that single piece of paper marked the beginning of something darker. Intimidation, fraud, and a battle for the right to simply exist on your own land. How far can power stretch before it breaks? And what happens when someone refuses to bow to it? This isn't just a story about a view tax. It's about control, truth, and the line between community and corruption. If you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare or questioned who really owns your peace of mind, this story will hit home. Before we dive in, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and share. It helps us keep uncovering stories that expose hidden abuses of power. Now, let's step inside the house that refused to surrender. The morning started like any other. Quiet, unremarkable. The kind of day meant for coffee and calm thoughts. The sun hadn't yet broken fully through the clouds, and the air carried that faint chill that clings to late October mornings. He stood by the kitchen window, mug in hand, watching condensation bead along the glass when he saw the envelope waiting in his mailbox. White, plain, harmless, or so it seemed. He walked out to get it, still half distracted by the sound of crows on the power lines. The envelope felt oddly heavy for something so thin. No logo, no seal, no return address, just his name typed neatly across the front. He tore it open right there on the porch, expecting junk mail, maybe a local flyer, but the first line stopped him cold. Your property is now under our jurisdiction. He reread the sentence, then again, slower this time, as though repetition might change its meaning. The letter went on to explain, if you could call it that a monthly assessment of $250 was now due to the Homeowners Association. The reason? View tax. Benefits derived from community landscaping and aesthetic maintenance. The phrasing felt like it had been stitched together from legal templates and arrogance. It wasn't a request. It was a declaration. For a moment, the kitchen felt smaller, the air thicker. He set the letter on the counter and opened the folder he'd kept in his desk drawer, the deed, the survey map, the county plat, all of it. His property line sat exactly where the records said it did, outside the HOA boundary. He'd checked 3 times before buying the place. His realtor had assured him, no fees, no rules, no board to answer to. He stared at the letter again, tracing the typed name at the bottom. Michelle Ashford, HOA board president. No signature, no seal, no pretense of authenticity. Just the confidence of someone used to getting away with it. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering leaves across the yard. He stood still, coffee cooling in his hand, realizing this wasn't a mistake. Someone had decided to redraw lines, literal ones, legal ones, and expect him to play along. That night, rain arrived. It came soft at first, then steady, tapping on the roof like a metronome marking time. He sat at his desk, laptop open, searching the phrase view tax. Nothing came up. He tried again. Aesthetic maintenance fee, landscaping surcharge, HOA boundary expansion. Still nothing. The term didn't exist in any legal database. It was fiction, crafted to sound official. He leaned back in his chair, listening to the rain and feeling that slow, creeping recognition. This wasn't about money. It was about control, about someone testing how far they could push before resistance began. He thought about ignoring it, throwing the letter away, pretending it had never arrived. But people like this, people who operated in gray zones of authority, counted on silence. They built their power on exhaustion and compliance. The next morning, he drove to the county recorder's office. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as a clerk named Estelle scrolled through digital records. She was calm, methodical, her voice steady as she confirmed what he already knew. His property wasn't under the HOA's jurisdiction. The boundaries hadn't changed since 1998. She even printed him a copy of the official map, circling his lot in red. "See?" she said, tapping the border. "You're outside their reach." He thanked her, folded the map, and drove home with the radio off, his mind replaying every line of that letter. He wanted to believe it was over, that facts and paperwork would be enough. But when he pulled into his driveway, the silence felt wrong. The house seemed to watch him back. He made dinner but didn't eat much. The letter sat on the counter like a weight. Each time he glanced at it, something in his gut tightened. Control rarely stops at a boundary once it's challenged. It pushes, looking for cracks. By nightfall, the rain returned, heavier this time. He sat near the window listening when the sound changed. A metallic clink, subtle, out of rhythm. He peered through the blinds and froze. At the end of his driveway, a black SUV idled, lights off, engine running. The shape of a person sat behind the wheel, motionless. Then, suddenly, twin floodlights flared to life, bleaching the yard in harsh white light. Every raindrop turned to glass under the glare. He couldn't see the face inside the vehicle, only a silhouette. They stayed there for 10 long minutes, neither moving nor speaking, just watching. Then, without warning, the lights went dark. The engine revved, and the SUV rolled away, tires hissing against the wet asphalt. He stood there for a long moment, breath shallow, the silence pressing in. Then instinct kicked in. He grabbed his phone, zoomed in, and snapped a photo of the license plate just before it disappeared around the corner. The image was grainy but clear enough. He saved it, locked the doors, checked every window. The fear wasn't paralyzing, just precise. Someone wanted to make a point. "We see you. We can reach you." He returned to his desk and opened a new document. The cursor blinked at him like a heartbeat. He started typing, dates, times, details, documenting everything. The letter, the fee, the vehicle. Every detail mattered. By morning, the rain had stopped. The air smelled sharp and clean, the kind of clarity that comes after a storm. But he knew better. This wasn't the end of something. It was the opening move. Standing at the window, he looked across the line that separated his untamed patch of grass from the HOA's perfect lawns. Somewhere beyond those fences sat the woman who'd sent the letter, confident he'd fold like everyone before him. He took one last sip of coffee, set the mug down, and whispered to himself, "Not this time." Because sometimes the fight doesn't start with a bang. It starts with paper and the courage not to sign it. The next few days passed quietly, almost too quietly. He tried to fall back into routine, coffee, work, walks to the end of the street, but every sound now felt slightly off. A passing car, the click of the mailbox lid, the silence of the phone that used to bring comfort. That letter had changed something. It had turned home into territory. On the third morning, another envelope appeared. Same white paper, same unmarked front. His pulse quickened. He hesitated before touching it as though it might burn. Inside was a single sheet, no explanation this time, just a bold title. Final notice. Below it, the words, "past due," glared like an accusation. They were charging him again, now threatening legal action within 7 days. But something else caught his attention. The second page. It was a map. A clean, professional layout showing his neighborhood in perfect lines and muted colors. But this map was wrong. The boundary that used to stop short of his fence now curved, looping neatly around his lot. His house, once outside the HOA's reach, was suddenly inside it. Someone had redrawn the world. He carried both maps, the official one from the county and the forged one from the letter, to his kitchen table. He spread them out side by side. The differences were subtle but deliberate. The real map showed the drainage ditch that marked the border. The fake one erased it entirely. The fence post, gone. The labeling nearly identical. Whoever did this wasn't careless. They were meticulous. He held the forged copy up to the light. The paper shimmered faintly, and beneath the printed lines he noticed something. A slight pixelation along the new boundary, the kind that comes from digital editing. Someone had scanned an official document, altered it, then printed it as truth. The realization hit like a cold wind. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was calculated fraud. That afternoon, he drove back to the county office. The same clerk, Estelle, looked up from her computer as he entered, her expression shifting from polite to concerned when she saw the papers in his hand. He laid them on the counter, the genuine one, the forgery. She studied both in silence, tracing the altered line with a fingertip. "This isn't ours," she said finally. "See here? The metadata shows the county's version hasn't been updated in over 20 years. This one," she tapped the forgery, "was created 3 weeks ago." He asked what that meant, though he already knew. Estelle sighed softly. "It means someone fabricated a public record. That's not a civil matter. That's criminal." The word hung in the air. Criminal. Until then, he'd thought of it as a petty power play, maybe a pushy board president trying to squeeze extra fees. But this? This was deliberate falsification. Someone had used the illusion of authority to take what wasn't theirs. He thanked Estelle, gathered both maps, and left the office. On the drive home, his thoughts turned from fear to anger. This wasn't just about him. If someone could alter boundaries this easily, how many others had they targeted? How many had simply paid the fees to avoid trouble? That night, he sat at his desk with a new kind of focus. The rain had returned, tapping on the roof like the steady rhythm of resolve. He opened his laptop and began searching the name on the letterhead. Michelle Ashford, the HOA president. Her digital footprint wasn't hard to find. Community posts, board announcements, a dozen smiling photos at local events. But beneath the polished exterior was something colder. He found old discussions in neighborhood forums, residents complaining about unfair fines, selective enforcement, intimidation disguised as policy. One post stood out, a homeowner describing how they'd been pressured into paying for landscaping outside their property line. The details mirrored his own story, almost word for word. He dug deeper, cross-referencing addresses. A pattern began to form. 4 families had moved out of the neighborhood over the past few years, all living along the border, all after disputes with the HOA. One had filed a complaint about harassment, but the record ended abruptly with the phrase, "case withdrawn." Another had listed their home far below market value for a quick sale. Piece by piece, a picture emerged. This wasn't random. Michelle had been using the HOA as a weapon, extending imaginary authority, enforcing phantom rules, and driving out anyone who resisted. Most people didn't have the time or energy to fight. Most just wanted peace. He understood that now. He closed the laptop and stared at the forged map spread across his desk. The red line that had no right to exist seemed almost to pulse under the desk lamp. He thought about what Estelle said. Criminal. It wasn't just a word. It was a line in its own right, one he couldn't let anyone cross again. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different. The lawns were still perfect, the mailboxes freshly painted, but there was something hollow about it all. The neatness looked less like pride now and more like control. The silence between houses carried tension, unspoken and heavy. He walked the edge of his yard, tracing the invisible border between freedom and subjugation. The grass under his boots was damp, the fence old but firm. This line, this simple line, was the difference between ownership and obedience. Someone had tried to erase it. He looked back at his home, at the windows that reflected the dull morning light. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a stand, a challenge to whoever thought they could rewrite truth on a map and make it real by repetition. He didn't know what would come next, letters, threats, or worse. But he knew one thing with certainty. He wouldn't run. Not now. Not when the truth was finally in his hands. He folded the forged map carefully, slid it into a plastic folder, and placed it beside the official copy. Evidence, proof. The beginning of a fight he hadn't asked for, but one he was now fully prepared to finish. The next week arrived with the kind of stillness that only feels calm if you don't know what's beneath it. He kept working from home, sending pitches, editing drafts, trying to convince himself that life was normal again. But it wasn't. Each sound outside drew his eyes to the window. Each late-night creak of the floorboards made him listen harder than he wanted to. The line had been crossed, and silence didn't mean peace anymore. Then one morning, something new appeared. A chain, thick and deliberate, looped tightly around the front gate, padlocked. The steel glinted under the early light like a challenge. It hadn't been there when he'd gone to bed. Someone had walked onto his property in the dark, trespassed, and left it there for him to find. No note, no reason, just the statement. You don't control this place anymore. He called the non-emergency police line. 2 officers showed up an hour later. One was young and bored, the other older, weary in the eyes. They looked at the gate, took a few photos, and exchanged a quiet glance. When he explained the situation, that he wasn't part of the HOA, that they were harassing him, the younger officer shrugged. HOAs can be tricky, he said. You might want to contact a lawyer. The older one added, sounds civil, not criminal. And that was it. No report, no follow-up. They drove away, leaving the chain still coiled around his gate like a collar. He fetched a pair of bolt cutters from the garage. The metal resisted, creaking with each press of the handles until it finally snapped. The sound was sharp and satisfying, echoing in the morning air like defiance. He gathered the broken pieces, carried them inside, and placed them carefully on his kitchen table beside the forged map and the letters. The evidence pile was growing. He was still staring at the chain when his phone rang. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. The voice on the other end was calm, precise, almost pleasant. This is Michelle, she said. I understand you've been confused about your assessment notice. He didn't reply right away. Confused isn't the word I'd use, he said finally. Michelle's tone didn't change. We've received reports that your vehicle blocks sight lines on the shared street access. It's a safety concern. We've placed a temporary barrier to ensure compliance. He felt his pulse tighten. You mean the chain, he said. You locked my gate. Community safety, she said, like it was a legal phrase. If you'd like the chain removed, you can settle your outstanding balance. The board's patient, but non-compliance has consequences. He took a slow breath. I don't belong to your HOA, he said, steady. You have no authority here. There was a pause, the kind that hums with quiet confidence. Our updated map says otherwise, she said. If you'd like to dispute it, feel free to file a formal challenge. Though I should warn you, legal fees tend to add up. You could avoid all that for just $250 a month. Her voice was silk over steel, the kind of practiced control that came from years of getting what she wanted. He realized she wasn't bluffing. She was reciting. She'd done this before. When the call ended, the silence in the house felt heavy. He placed the phone down gently, as if afraid the sound might summon her voice again. Then he exhaled. Long, controlled, the kind of breath you take before deciding to fight back. He opened his laptop and began searching her name again, this time pairing it with words like lawsuit, harassment, fraud. The results were buried, fragments scattered across forums and real estate complaint boards. But patterns emerged, stories of board intimidation, mysterious fines, threats of liens that never materialized but scared homeowners into paying. He leaned back, the screen's glow painting his face in pale light. This wasn't just neighborhood politics. This was a system of coercion built on fear and bureaucracy, where silence became complicity and compliance became currency. And now, she'd picked the wrong target. That evening, his phone buzzed again. This time, a social media notification. Someone had tagged him in a post. He opened it, and his stomach dropped. Michelle had posted a photo of his house in the community group, the caption reading, "New resident refuses to follow community guidelines, endangering neighbors, refusing cooperation." The comments were piling up, some sympathetic, others venomous, words like entitled, selfish, troublemaker. He wanted to reply, to explain, to show the documents that proved the truth. But he didn't. This was her stage, and anything he said would only feed her performance. So he took screenshots instead, every comment, every timestamp, another layer of proof. Later that night, the SUV returned. He didn't flinch this time. He stood by the window, the camera on his phone already rolling. The same headlights, the same stillness. 10 minutes of watching. He filmed every second. When the engine finally growled to life and the vehicle pulled away, he saved the video to 3 different backups. Evidence. Always evidence. He sat in the dark afterward, heart still racing but mind clearer than ever. Fear had turned into something sharper. Purpose. Every move they made gave him leverage. Every threat was documentation. They weren't intimidating him anymore. They were building his case. By dawn, the sky had turned gray, streaked with the faint blue of early morning. He hadn't slept, but he didn't feel tired. The line had been crossed too many times to retreat now. He gathered the chain, the letters, the maps, the screenshots, all of it, and stacked them neatly in a folder. The air in the house felt different, charged with quiet resolve. He looked out the window toward the perfect lawns of the HOA. Somewhere beyond those fences, Michelle Ashford was probably sipping her coffee, certain that she was still in control. She didn't know yet that she'd overplayed her hand. He whispered to himself, almost smiling, "Let's see how you like documentation." Because intimidation only works until the paper trail starts talking back. Morning came gray and silent, the kind of silence that feels like the pause before something important. He sat at his kitchen table, the folder of evidence open before him. Letters, photos, screenshots, forged maps, the broken chain. Each piece told part of the same story. Intimidation disguised as authority. It was time to stop reacting and start responding. He searched online for real estate attorneys who specialized in boundary disputes and HOA law. The first few listings felt generic, too polished, too corporate. But one name stood out. Preston Halstead. His bio was simple. Land use, fraud, HOA litigation. The reviews below were direct. Knows how to handle bullies. That was all he needed to read. He sent an email. To his surprise, Preston replied within an hour. The message was short, confident. Seen this before. Bring everything. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. It felt like a lifeline dropped into chaos. The next morning, he drove downtown. Preston's office wasn't grand, just a modest space wedged between a dry cleaner and a tax service. Inside, file boxes lined the walls, neatly labeled in tight handwriting. The air smelled faintly of old paper and black coffee. Preston was younger than expected, mid-30s maybe, with dark glasses and the calm focus of someone who'd read too many lies for too long. "Let's start from the beginning," Preston said, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. No small talk, no pretense, just business. He unpacked the folder and spread out the contents. Letters first, then maps, photos, the chain, screenshots of social media posts. Preston studied each one quietly, occasionally nodding or jotting notes in a small legal pad. When he finally looked up, his expression had shifted, something between concern and calculation. "This isn't just harassment," he said. "It's fraud. Maybe extortion. And if that map was forged using a public document, We're talking about a federal offense." The words hit like steady blows, each one heavier than the last. Fraud, extortion, federal. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was fact. Preston continued, his tone steady. "I've seen this kind of setup before. HOA presidents who think the rules make them untouchable. They test the boundaries, literally, and when no one pushes back, they keep expanding. You've got evidence most people never collect. That's leverage." For the first time in weeks, he felt something close to relief. Not comfort, just validation. Proof that he hadn't imagined it, that his paranoia had a purpose. Preston leaned forward. "The next step is filing a civil claim, fraud, harassment, and falsification of documents. But we'll also submit everything to the district attorney's office for criminal review. Forging county maps crosses more than one line." He nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. "She won't stop easily." "No," Preston said. "People like this never do, but that's why we use the system they think they own." They spent the next 3 hours piecing the timeline together. Preston had a process. Dates first, then escalation points, then impact. Every letter, every call, every sighting of the SUV was plotted out in clean sequence. It wasn't just evidence now, it was narrative, structure, motive. A story the law could understand. Preston explained each step. Filing an injunction to stop contact, submitting copies of the forged map to the county registrar, and preparing a cease and desist order. "You don't have to confront her anymore," he said. "The paper will do it for you." By the time they finished, the afternoon light had shifted to gold. Preston leaned back in his chair and asked one last question. "How far are you willing to take this?" He didn't hesitate. "As far as it needs to go." Preston nodded once, satisfied. "Then let's make it official." That night, back at home, he sat at the same kitchen table where the first letter had arrived weeks earlier. Only now, the fear that had once filled the room was replaced by focus. He had names, documents, dates, and a lawyer who believed him. The chaos had a direction now, but Preston's warning echoed in his head. She'll escalate before she folds. He knew it was true. Michelle wasn't the type to surrender quietly. People who build their identity on control don't give it up without a spectacle. He stared out the window at the dark neighborhood. The perfect lawns glistened faintly under streetlights. Somewhere in that symmetry, she was watching, waiting for his next move. Instead of fear, he felt something else. Anticipation. Every threat she'd made, every boundary she'd tried to rewrite, had become ammunition. The power was shifting, and she didn't even know it yet. He poured himself a glass of water, opened his laptop, and wrote a single line in a new document. Control only works when silence agrees. He saved it under a folder labeled Case File, Ashford, alongside scanned documents, photos, and video evidence. It wasn't just data anymore. It was armor. Outside, the wind rattled the fence. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then stopped. The street was still again. He took one last look at the shadowed outline of the HOA across the road. Then he closed the blinds. The next morning, Preston's email arrived. Filing submitted. County notified. Expect a reaction. He smiled slightly. The fight had finally moved from his driveway to the courtroom, away from intimidation and into the language Michelle couldn't manipulate: law, evidence, and truth. For the first time since the first letter arrived, he felt like he was standing on solid ground again. And the best part? This time, the paper was on his side. The morning of the community fair arrived cold and bright, the kind of day that pretends to be peaceful. The air carried a hint of wood smoke, laughter echoed faintly through the park, and families moved between booths with paper cups of cider in their hands. On the surface, it looked like any small-town event. Neighbors smiling, kids chasing balloons, everything neat and picture-perfect. But beneath the calm hum of conversation A quiet reckoning was about to unfold. He and Preston arrived early. They set up their folding table near the entrance. Nothing flashy. Just a white banner with black lettering. Truth about HOA abuse. The words were simple, unembellished, impossible to twist. On the table lay the evidence, the official county map, the forged version with the redrawn boundary, copies of the letters, screenshots of the social posts, and written statements from other victims who'd finally decided to speak up. Preston arranged each document like a curator, laying out artifacts of control and resistance. "Let the paper speak," he said quietly. And it did. The display wasn't dramatic, but it was impossible to ignore. Side by side, truth and fabrication told a story anyone could understand. Within the first hour, people began to slow down as they passed. A few glanced curiously and kept walking, but others stopped, brows furrowing as they read. Someone whispered the HOA president's name. Then another voice murmured, "I thought it was just me." The small crowd began to grow. An elderly woman approached the table, her hands trembling as she pointed to one of the notarized statements. "That's mine," she said softly. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "I paid her $1,200 last year for landscaping fees that weren't even real. I didn't know what else to do. I thought I'd lose my house." Her eyes glistened, but her voice steadied. "I'm glad you didn't stay quiet." Preston nodded respectfully, his calm presence grounding the moment. "You're not alone," he said. More people came forward, one by one, quietly at first, then louder, their stories overlapping like pieces of a mosaic. A man in his 40s described how he'd lost $50,000 in home value because Michelle had labeled his property a code violation zone online. Another woman explained how her family had left the neighborhood entirely after months of relentless notices and false fines. As the stories surfaced, a murmur rippled through the fair. The small crowd grew to dozens. Cameras came out. Someone began recording. The illusion of control, the image Michelle had built over years of forced order and community pride, was starting to fracture. And then, as if summoned by tension itself, she appeared. Michelle Ashford, HOA president. Blazer pressed, hair perfect, walking through the crowd with the practiced authority of someone who still believed she could control the narrative. Her smile was thin and brittle as she reached the table. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice carrying enough to make nearby conversations falter. Preston met her gaze evenly. "Documentation," he said. "Would you like to explain why your version of the boundary map doesn't match the county's?" She scanned the display quickly, her eyes darting over the evidence. "This is slander," she said loudly, addressing the crowd now rather than him. "These people are spreading lies to discredit the HOA. Everything I've done has been within board authority." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, Preston held up the two maps, one official, one forged, side by side. "This map," he said, "was created 20 years ago, never amended. And this one," he tapped the fake. "This was edited 3 weeks ago using image manipulation software. We've verified the metadata. Would you like to explain that under oath?" Her jaw tightened. For a moment, silence stretched between them. The crowd waited. Michelle's confidence wavered, just slightly. She drew herself upright again, her voice sharper now. "That's an internal draft. You have no right to distribute private HOA materials." Preston didn't blink. "Public maps aren't private property. Neither is truth." The murmuring grew louder now. Questions whispered, some voices angry. "Is that why my fees went up? Did she do this to everyone?" The control she'd spent years maintaining was dissolving in real time, not through confrontation, but exposure. A reporter from a local paper arrived, drawn by the crowd. She held out her phone, recording as she asked, "Ms. Ashford, are you aware of the forgery allegations?" Michelle's face flushed crimson. This is absurd. These accusations are fabricated by a disgruntled homeowner, someone trying to undermine the community I've protected for years." The reporter turned to him. "And you?" He didn't raise his voice. "I didn't want to fight," he said simply. "I just wanted to live in my home without being lied to." The words hung in the air, quiet, unpolished, and real. Michelle turned sharply, pushing through the onlookers. "You'll regret this," she hissed. But even as she said it, her authority was unraveling. Cameras followed her retreat. The story, once confined to letters and private threats, was now public record. By evening, local news sites had picked up the footage. Headlines appeared online. "Homeowner exposes HOA president for fraudulent boundary scheme." Preston's phone buzzed non-stop. Reporters, lawyers, even other residents reaching out. 2 days later, it happened. He was at home when he heard the sound of car doors outside. 2 police vehicles parked neatly in front of Michelle's house. Neighbors gathered in small clusters as officers walked to her door. There were no shouts, no drama, just procedure. They spoke to her briefly, then turned her around and cuffed her hands behind her back. The sight was strangely quiet. No triumph, no applause, just the end of a reign built on fear. Watching from his window, he didn't feel joy, just a deep, steady exhale, the kind that comes after weeks of tension finally release. The storm had broken, and the air felt clean again. For the first time in months, the neighborhood didn't feel hostile. It felt awake. The days that followed felt unreal, like waking up from a dream that had lasted too long. For the first time in months, no letters arrived, no lights outside the window, no chain on the gate. The silence that once felt ominous now felt clean, restored. News spread fast. The story hit local outlets first, then regional ones. HOA president charged with fraud and forgery. The headline looked surreal, sitting beneath Michelle's smiling profile picture, taken from one of her old community events. The woman who'd built her identity around control was finally facing a system she couldn't manipulate. He didn't go to the courthouse on the day of her arraignment, but Preston did. Later that afternoon, his lawyer called, his voice steady but lighter than usual. "It's done," he said. "She's been charged with multiple counts. Fraud, forgery, and extortion. The DA's office is moving forward." He stood at his window listening to the rain return, soft against the glass. It sounded different now, less like a warning, more like a cleansing rhythm. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered, proof that peace isn't the absence of noise, but the presence of justice. When the trial came weeks later, he sat quietly in the back of the courtroom. Michelle was there. Smaller somehow, her shoulders curved inward, her voice barely audible as she answered the judge's questions. She pled guilty to reduced charges, 18 months suspended, 3 years probation, restitution to every victim she'd exploited. The system she'd once used as a weapon now held her accountable piece by piece, clause by clause. When the judge asked if she wanted to make a statement, she hesitated. Then, almost mechanically, she said the words, "I abused my position. I falsified documents. I intimidated homeowners. I'm sorry." They didn't sound heartfelt, but they didn't need to. The truth was finally on record. He didn't feel triumph. What he felt was something quieter, relief tinged with exhaustion. Justice isn't cinematic. It's procedural, slow, patient. It arrives not with applause, but with paperwork and signatures. And yet, that slow, grinding machinery had finally worked. After the sentencing, the neighborhood changed. The HOA held an emergency election. The remaining board members, those who'd looked away for too long, resigned one by one. In their place came people who actually lived like neighbors, not enforcers. The new president, Geneva, was soft-spoken and methodical, an older woman who had once paid bogus fines herself. Her first act was transparency. She published every HOA financial record online. No secrets, no hidden budgets, She implemented open meetings, community voting, and mandatory oversight from non-board residents. For the first time, people actually attended. They asked questions. They were heard. Order didn't come from fear anymore. It came from trust. A week later, Geneva stopped by his house in person. She carried no letter, no clipboard, just a quiet sincerity. "On behalf of the new board," she said, "I want to apologize. What happened shouldn't have happened, not to you, not to anyone." He thanked her, and for the first time since all of this began, he believed someone meant it. Over the next few months, he returned to writing full-time. His words came slower but steadier. One afternoon, he received an email from a small publisher offering to turn his story into a book, a guide for homeowners dealing with HOA abuse. He hesitated at first, unsure if he wanted to relive it all. But then he thought about the people who'd whispered, "I thought it was just me." Maybe, he realized, the story wasn't just his. He wrote it carefully. No sensationalism, no revenge fantasy, just the truth as it happened. How fear can wear a polite smile, how power hides behind paperwork, how silence feeds control, and how patience, when documented properly, can break it. When the book was released, messages began to arrive from strangers. One read, "Your story helped me fight my HOA. I checked my property lines. You were right. They were lying. Thank you." Another wrote, "I stopped being afraid." Those words meant more than any verdict ever could. Seasons changed. The grass behind his house grew thick again, the fence still marking that invisible border between his freedom and their order. He built a small wooden sign at the edge of his property. Simple, unvarnished cedar with words burned into the grain. "This land is free." Below it, smaller text read, "Verified by county record." It wasn't defiance. It was closure. Neighbors would stop sometimes, reading it quietly before moving on. A few even built their own signs, tiny declarations of autonomy, proof that what happened here mattered beyond one address. Preston wrote about the case on his legal blog, "When an HOA Goes Rogue." It spread quickly through homeowner forums and advocacy groups. The story became a reference, a reminder that systems of control only survive when people stop questioning them. A year later, on another quiet October morning, he stood once again at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee in his hand. The yard was green, wild, imperfect, the way he liked it. The rain had started again, soft and steady, carrying the same rhythm that had once haunted him. But this time, it sounded like peace. He thought of Michelle, wherever she was now, and felt nothing. No bitterness, no anger, just distance. She'd lost her power the moment truth caught up. He'd found his when he refused to let fear rewrite his boundaries. The fight hadn't made him bitter. It made him aware. He took a slow sip of coffee, watching droplets roll down the glass. Outside, the wind bent the grass in waves, the fence line holding firm. The sign at the edge of his property stood still, the wood darkened by rain, the letters bold against the gray sky. He smiled faintly. Freedom doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stands quietly in the rain and stays standing, and this time he knew it always would.